Good evening. This is Brother Stanley, Scism, and this is Pauline Epistles 1, which is Romans and Galatians. This is the third session. We are now starting at Galatians chapter 1, verse 5. Paul has been saying that he is amazed that they are turning away from God who called them. He has said that the God has, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen. And he has, this is a doxology when you have this amen on the end of it. And he says there's been a present evil age, which applies, of course, that there's another age to come after that, which is true. 2 Thessalonians 2 talks about the new age to come. And there are, of course, many other references to this in Matthew 13, Romans 12, 2 Corinthians 4. And the reference to our God and Father is also in Philippians 4. Paul says that he is shocked, that he is amazed, he is astounded, astonished that they are turning away from the God who saved them. Chapter 1, verse 6 through chapter 2, verse 14 is a recapitulation of Paul's life and ministry. And now here in chapter 1, verses 6 to 9, he rebukes the Galatians. He upbraids them for desertion. And he says that, and usually Paul's letters start with a greeting, and he gives compliments to the people. I'm so happy about you. I'm so proud of you. I'm so thankful for you. I pray for you. I remember you every day in my prayers. Not this letter. This letter, he does not find anything to praise among them. And instead, he launches straight into this rebuke of what they have been doing. He says God has called them. We are called by God. Romans 8, verse 28 to 30. And Romans 9, Romans 11, verse 29. And 1 Corinthians 1:9, the introduction to 1 Corinthians, says, again to that church, also where Paul has been having trouble, he says, God has called you. Here in Galatians chapter 1 through verse 15, he mentions it again. And then that's in Ephesians 4, beginning of the chapter. And in 1 Thessalonians and 2 Timothy, beginning of the chapter, and 1st, 2 Peter, beginning of the chapter. God has called you, but you have turned to a different gospel. Now, gospel is an Old English word which means good news. So you have turned to a different good news, which is really bad news, because it's enslaving you. 2 Corinthians 11, verse 4. This legalism is enslaving you. And he says that, what is this bad news that they are being told? The bad news they are being told is that the Gentile Christians must be circumcised in order to be saved. This was not a health issue. Like circumcision was practiced in Western societies for a long time, to the whole society, as a health issue. It felt it was likely to prevent disease, but that's not what this is about. This is, you must do this in order to be saved, and that's what Paul is objecting to. He faced this here in Galatians, several places. He talks about it in 1 Timothy and in 2 Corinthians and in Romans. And he says, there are people who are causing you confusion. And who are these people causing confusion? There are some people who have come up from Jerusalem. And Paul talks about people who came up from James. Now, James is a half-brother of Jesus, and James is the leader of the Jerusalem church now that Peter has left there and is traveling all over. So James is the elder, the bishop of the church in Jerusalem. And as such, he makes a judgment in Acts 15 in that role. And these legalists are saying things that are unauthorized by the good news. Now, when you talk about authorization, again, Paul said, I'm not called by a man or by a group of people, I'm called by God. And the legalists are things that are unauthorized, saying things that are unauthorized by God. And so it is actually a perversion of the good news. Jeremiah 23, verses 16-36 talks about these perversions of God's good news. It's a distortion, and it's not the real good news, and so consequently, it's not good news at all. Some Jews claimed that they got their message from an angel. Chapter 3, verse 19 says that this is not from an angel. Paul says, I've got my message from Jesus Christ himself. So there is this, the real gospel, verse 8, is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is defined in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 1, 2 Corinthians 11, verse 4. Anything else is another gospel, and it is no good news at all, verse 7 says. Satan has disguises, and it fools many people. Satan's disguises have fooled many people, and they are fooled. Right now, they're fooling the Galatians. This one is. And so Paul says, let anyone who preaches another gospel than the one we preach to you, even if it is an angel from heaven, should be condemned, eternally condemned. Now, the Cotton Patch version says, let him go to hell, which, with a footnote there saying that the Greek is even stronger than this, which is not surprising because condemned here means damned. The Greek word anathema is translating the Hebrew word kerem, which means that it is dedicated to total destruction. Leviticus 27, verses 28-29, when something is anathematized, it is dedicated to complete total destruction. First, it meant about pagan temple offerings that are made in payments for a vow, and later it came to mean a curse, as here, and in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 3, and 1 Corinthians 16, verse 22, where he closes that letter this way also, Romans 9, verse 3. And then Paul repeats the curse and says it again. It's a double curse for emphasis' sake. They had accepted originally a true gospel. Romans 16, verse 17. Christ had been preached to them. And now Paul is beginning to defend the gospel that he, in verses 10 to 12, he's defending the gospel that he preached to them. And he says, after he does this double curse of anybody who preaches something else, he says, now, does that sound like I'm trying to ingratiate? Of course not, okay. Am I trying to please people if I'm cursing them? No, of course not. He's not trying to please them. And so he says, if I'm a servant of Christ, and I would not trying to still please people. So what's he talking about? Still pleasing. Is he talking about his mission practices? 1 Corinthians 9? No, it's probably talking about his pre-Christian days, because he's, as in Philippians 3, where he talks about what he used to do before he came to Christ. So this is his pre-Christian days. He used to try to please people. Who was he trying to please then? He was trying to please his Jewish leaders. He was trying to please them by arresting and having the Christians arrested and killed. And so that was, but he's not trying to please people now. Instead, he's trying to please Jesus Christ, who stopped him on the road to Damascus. So now it's his fidelity is not to humans, it is to Jesus Christ. Acts 5 and Ephesians 6. Talks about he's a servant of Christ. And by the time Paul is writing these letters, calling himself a servant of Christ becomes a standard identity. Romans 1, Philippians 1, he opens his letters saying this, that he is a servant of Christ. Verse 11, he says, verse 11, he says, I want you to know, okay, and he's beginning to do a presentation of the good news. And you should see 1 Corinthians 15 again for that, what that good news is. Why should the Galatians listen to Paul instead of to the Judaizers? Because, number one, his message is received directly from Christ. Jewish scholars frequently depended on teachers, but Paul says, no, I received this directly from Jesus Christ. Now, there were other things where he went to visit Peter, for example, to learn about the life of Christ on earth. And so there, of course, he was learning from Peter. But in terms of what the good news is and the message he is to preach, that he is received directly from Jesus Christ. And you can compare, when you talk, I want you to know, you can compare 2 Corinthians chapters 11 and 12. And he says, the gospel I preached, and he calls it my gospel in Romans 2. He says that people are made right with God by grace through faith, not by obeying the old law. This is the gospel. People are made right by grace through faith, not by obeying the Old Testament law. And he emphasizes this in Romans 10, verses 9 to 13, Ephesians 2, verse 8 to 9, that we are saved by grace, not of works, lest any man should boast. Verse 12, he has said that he received this good news directly from Jesus, and he received it by revelation. The Greek word, apocalypsis, from which we get apocalypse, okay? The book of Revelation is called the Apocalypse because that's the Greek word, revelation. And God reveals to people, 2 Corinthians 12 talks about, and Galatians 2 talks also. How does God reveal? He reveals by his Spirit. And the Spirit reveals, among other things, the mystery of Christ. And what is that mystery? That through the good news, the Gentiles are heirs together with Israel, members together of one body, sharers together in the promises of Jesus Christ. Ephesians chapter 3, beginning of the chapter. So Paul is emphasizing this. We are saved by grace through faith. And the mystery that was not known in the past is that the Gentiles would inherit with Israel this message and so this verse 13, Paul says, now you know that about my previous way of life. He had been a highly successful Jew. He had, you can see it at the beginning of Acts chapter 8. You can see it in Acts 22 and Acts 26, Philippians 3, his testimonies. And he's recounting in chapter 1, verse 13 through chapter 2, verse 14. He's recounting his own background, his calling, and his mission. His background, his calling, and his mission, in that order. And he talks about my previous life, and he talks about in Judaism. Now, the word Judaism comes from Judah, who was one of Jacob's sons, and which was the southern kingdom that was destroyed in the 6th century due to idolatry and was sent into captivity, into exile in Babylon. And here he says in verses 13 through 24, he talks his conversion, the early church, his apostleship. The church of God is the replacement of the Old Testament assembly or Lord's community from Numbers chapter 16 and Numbers chapter 20. There are many times when the church of God is mentioned. Also in Acts 20, he says to the elders that this is the church of God, which God has bought with his own blood. Everything else God created, but the church God purchased with his own blood. And so this is emphasized. 1 Corinthians 11, verses 16 to 22 is a passage on this. 1 Timothy 3, verses 5 to 15 talks about this also. He had persecuted the church. He was very zealous for his ancestral traditions. He mentions this in the next verse. And zealous for the traditions of his ancestors. And he mentions it also in Philippians 3. He tried to destroy the church. And he began to do this in Acts 8. And he was still at it in Acts 9 when Jesus Christ stopped him. Who are you persecuting? I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. So, nobody can, of course, destroy the church since it's built on God. And so as long as the church itself, entity, it simply cannot be destroyed because it's built by God. The people, of course, who stray from that message, they can end up being destroyed, those individuals. He later went, Paul, when he talks about this, he talks about his conversion and calling. Then he talks about his initial relations with the apostles. He talks about that in verses 18 to 24. And then he will talk about going to Jerusalem. He will talk about that beginning of chapter 2. And after that, he will talk about the incident in Antioch. But now, in verse 14, he says that Paul, see, he did not know that God was planning to save the Gentiles. And he did not know that himself, and he was persecuting the church. But then this has been revealed. Verse 14, Paul had been extremely zealous, persecuting the church with his own faultless legalistic righteousness, until he found out that everything he had thought was a credit to him was instead one big deficit, one big debit. As he mentions this in Philippians chapter 3, that everything, using accounting language, everything I thought was on my plus side of my ledger, I found out was on the negative side, the debit side of my ledger. And so I actually had nothing, and everything I thought was worth something was actually dung, garbage, useless, trash. In verses 11 to 21, Paul's presentation, he uses the oratorical forms of his day. Number one, he narrates the facts behind. That's verses, chapter 1, verses 2 to 14. Chapter 1, verse 12 through chapter 2, verse 14. Then he states his contention, after narrating the past, that of justification by faith. And that is the punchline, chapter 2, verse 15 to 21.